This is like looking at a map of New York, isn't it? Why are we looking at this? I'll explain.
Welcome to Ralph's house!
If you've been watching Ralph's House for a while, you'll know that from time to time, and not all of it I put on video, I must admit, because I'm just too busy, but from time to time I dabble in electronics across the whole sphere. It depends what it is and whether I want to repair it or whether I fancy making something or modifying something, which I do. And in fact, at the moment, I've dug out my Christmas lights, which run on 3 giant D cells, which aren't cheap to buy, you know. And it's just a string of white LEDs, but it's got a sequence with it, so you can, you know, it'll flow up and down, or they'll blink, or, you know, that sort of stuff. And I thought, 3 D cells, that's 4.5 volts. That's exactly the same as a 18650 lithium ion battery, which would pack a lot more punch over a period of time. So I thought, right, what I need, because the box it comes in, or the box that holds the batteries, pretty big. So I'm thinking, well, I can get a 18650 battery holder in there, no problem. And then all I need is a small USB charging board for 18650 batteries, which, as it happens, I bought about 10 of those, I think, from AliExpress some time ago, because I thought, they'll come in handy, and they just sit in one of the drawers in my electronics store. So I kind of, well, probably at some point over the weekend, I'll have a go at that. I might even video that, we'll see. A bit like Big Clive, only more clumsy. But I was looking at this board, and it reminds me of one day I went round to see my father, and bear in mind I've worked in software, hardware and networks, which is a rare thing because usually people specialise in one thing. Like you get people that just fix printers, you know. But I've worked across the whole spectrum, I think, really. Now I'm out of that. I've got no interest in IT at all. I just use my PC to catch up on the news, catch up with friends, maybe watch a video on YouTube, and that's it. I don't have a television. I'm quite happy with it. But I was looking at these boards and thinking how electronics has evolved. Now, I was born in 1959, which ages me, doesn't it? But throughout the, not that I remember the 50s, in fact, I don't even really remember the 60s. It was the 70s I kind of lived through. But in the 50s and 60s, we had valve amplifiers, gramophones. It was only later they became 60s, I think they started to call them record players, and then they just became hi-fi after that. But a lot of the early stuff was valve. Then as we got into the 60s, late 60s, into the 70s, we're into transistors, and then the very beginning of integrated circuits. But on the old stuff, you know, you might power them from 240 volt, you know, a lot of the valve radios are that. And some of them step it up to about 400 volts, some of the early radios. And TVs, you're talking kilovolts in places. Certainly some parts of a TV set you want to keep well clear of. My late Uncle Alan, and by the way, this didn't kill him, but he decided he'd got a problem with his television. My dad told me this, and he stuck one of those butter knives, you know, the sort of ones you got in the 30s, flat, wide blade, you know the type, perfect for spreading on bread. He decided he was going to go in the back of the TV set, you see, and twiddle about. I don't know why. Anyway, apparently there was an almighty flash, and he was flung across the room and hit the wall on the other side. That's how much volts were in the back of that set. And when he looked down, he just got the handle in his hand, and the blade had vanished completely. It had evaporated. So early electronics, they did tend to run at high volts, but they worked out, as they managed to get things a little bit smaller, that actually for most of the work on a PC board, you don't need to be running at high volts. You can run it all at 5 volts because, take this is a graphics card, for instance. And so a big chunk of the board, I'll do this in very simplistic terms, but a big chunk of the board is just saying, all right, well, that needs to go there. All right, change that to that. No, read this, read that. That's what most of what you're looking at on this board is doing. And it only needs 5 volts to do that. In fact, in some cases, it will run on 3 volt. It needs nothing. It's only when you want to see something or hear something that you've got to amplify it, you see. Well, at that point, they use, because in the old days, all the circuit boards went on just, well, it was all on the one side. But now they do a thing called through holes. So you're now looking at almost a 3-dimensional circuit board, because there'll be components on this side and components on the back. Look, you can just about see them through there. Well, so usually everything's running on low volts, and then when you get to the final chip, which has to amplify it usually, so it can interface with anything else, or so you can hear it, and at that point it starts getting really hot, especially when it's a chip not much bigger than that. So they have to put this massive heat sink on it, all this copper pipe in these fans, just to cool that final processor, like it is in PCs. So, although the world has moved on somewhat, there are inherent difficulties when it comes to working on things this small. Now, Radio Cruncher, who I generally watch on a Sunday, in fact, if you want to find me, look for Radio Cruncher. He normally comes on about 2 in the afternoon on YouTube with a live stream. And it's radios that he's predominantly about. It's not centred to my world, but I love watching him repair them. You learn quite a lot while you're doing it. There's a lot of people in the chat. Some are experienced, some are not. But it's just a pleasant afternoon, 2 hours. Anyway, he works on radios. And I think he prefers the sort of germanium transistor era. That's why he likes Hackers and Roberts radios. He loves those. Although, I think he's got his shortwave license. But if you watch him, he'll often work on circuit boards like this, and it's a frustrating thing. And that's why one of the things I had to buy, not just for working on these, but for anything small now, I had to buy a desktop microscope, not particularly strong, but long enough, if you put a board under the microscope like this, you can see what you're doing, enough to solder. You certainly I couldn't do it in my eyes, not now. But it's fascinating the way circuit boards have changed. This is dusty, isn't it? It's fascinating how electronics has changed in that time. And now we're moving into a period where we can potentially use graphene and lots of other things, and electronics will move on in another leap. But the point is, I came round to see my dad one day, and he'd got a PC taken apart in the middle of his room, with him sat on the floor with it, with the screwdriver. And he looked up as I came in, and I said to him, "What are you doing, Dad?" Now, bear in mind, I worked in software, hardware and networks right across the board. I didn't specialise in one field. I just did a lot of different things. Mostly these days, people that say they're in IT, well, they're just printer specialists or they're just network specialists. Rare that you get all of them. And I just happened to be one that could do all of them. But there he was, sat there with his computer, taken apart in his living room. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I thought I'd look and see how it all works." To which I said, "Why?" He said, "What do you mean, why?" I said, "Well, to what end? What are you going to gain in if you know? You can't fix it." Which was true. Unless you've got the proper gear for it. People do fix them, if your mobile phone needs a new battery or the screen's gone or something, you might put it into a phone shop. Personally, I don't. I just throw the phone away and get another one. But by and large, we don't repair stuff. You know, as I say, Radio Cruncher might on a Sunday, and the guy in the phone shop down the road. But usually the repair bill on these things is more than the damn thing's worth. But there he was, taking this thing apart. And I said, you're wasting your time. I said, we live in an era now when we don't need to know how it works. It reminds me, if anybody ever seen that great film with Yul Brynner called Westworld, and one of the quotes from that film, when the robots go mad, and I say it's a brilliant film, the first one, because so much is left to your imagination. You just believe it. But when the robots break down, there's a few technicians, and one of them says, well, these machines were designed by other machines. We don't know how they work. And that's true, because by and large, all these things are worked out. Certainly the circuit design's worked out on a computer. Modern cars are the same, aren't they? That's how modern electronics has gone. But there he was, sat with it on his living room carpet, taking it apart to find out why. It's good and bad, isn't it? It's great that we've got all this technology, but we're setting ourselves up to fail, aren't we? We can recycle to a certain extent, but where's this stuff ultimately going to end up? It's going to end up in the atmosphere, it's going to end up in landfill. And it's the same with quick fashions. I'm not singling out Primark particularly, but it's an example where they produce things very cheap. They're generally synthetic materials. They don't break down. They end up in great big piles in South Africa and places like that, polluting everything. It's in our oceans, it's everything. So although we make all these great advances in the world, we take several steps backward, don't we? So when you look at a circuit board like this, keep that in mind. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.